Hello people of YouTube, Mishka Valhalla here. Today we are going to talk about the gods, or should I say Jotuns, Mani and Sol. Mani and Sol are the Jotuns of the moon and the sun, and Sol, in a more Germanic variation of her name, would be Sunna. And Sunna, of course, had her name attributed to Sunday. That's why in most Germanic languages you have Sunday or Sol's Day as being, the day of the sun. But people, of course, Christians celebrate or go to church on Sunday. But the day itself was named after the sun. And this was done by the Romans during the, earlier on during the Roman Empire, while Tacitus was doing his, research on Germania. Basically, many of the days of the week were already named after Roman gods in the Roman Empire, so they tried to synchronize the cultures in the north, to that of the Romans and the Greeks. And so essentially they found the Germanic or Norse gods that were equivalent to the Roman gods that were on the certain days of the week. So it wasn't essentially a Norse or Germanic invention, since they didn't really have concepts of days of the week. It was more of a lunar calendar when it comes to the Norse especially. And what I mean by that is the Norse focus on the moon when it comes to certain holidays, and it was same for sure when it came to the Anglo-Saxons, because the Anglo-Saxons of course celebrated many of their holidays also on the full moon. And by doing that, holidays like Yule would be on the full moon, while other pagan cultures would be more interested in celebrating the solstice rather than Yule. The Norse attributed Yule to the end of winter and not the middle of winter. So of course there was cultural differences when it came to certain groups in Europe. Anyway, since we were talking about Mani, the moon, since they were following a lunar calendar, let me get this fire started more. It's going to be as bright as it'll be for a bit. So Mani, of course, is the god of the moon. And, he is a Jotun, just like Sunna. And, people hear the word Jotun and they freak out. But, Jotuns are typically deities that are more chaotic in nature. This is true. But usually they represent actual physical bodies of nature, such as Mani being the man in the moon, and Sunna being, the sun goddess, also a fire Jotun, from the realm of fire, pulling the sun wheel. Or should I say the sun itself. So she's a personification of the sun, while Mani would be, the personification of the moon. But then again, there are other entities that are associated with these astral bodies, the sun and the moon, particularly in the Norse tradition. And when we are especially talking about the myths and how they would have compared and been perceived in society, and we are about to get right into that. There's definitely a lot more than meets the eye when it comes to these entities, Mani and Sol. So we are going to start with Mani. So Mani is of course the man in the moon. He is a personification of the moon itself, but also he has a son and a daughter. His son is Huki, which means healing, and Huki is basically sort of an entity that is attributed to the moon, because it is believed in many cultures that the moon is essentially a healing body, a healing astral body, because it is also connected to water, because it controls the waves and the currents. So basically, when it comes to water itself, it's typically referred to as a very cleansing element. And since the moon has a strong effect on water and also emotions, it makes sense that, that water, since water is very often associated with emotions, and we are going to talk more about that when we get to the rune Lagus. But focusing on the moon, I do definitely know that it is a true statistic that there is a high percentage of crime on the full moon, and the moon has always been associated with trickery. So, and not all cultures, but many cultures, especially Native American cultures, certain Native American cultures such as the Toltec tribe, and many others, possibly Inuit tribes as well. But when we are talking about the Norse, Huki could sort of be a healing figure for Mani, because Mani does battle with a familiar of his, which is a wolf. And this wolf is referred to as Hati. So Hati is a wolf that essentially chases Mani, and this wolf could be a representation of the lunar eclipse. So when Mani is particularly, I guess you could say, cornered by the wolf, that's when a lunar eclipse occurs. And the mythological story is that the wolf is chasing Mani and seeking to destroy him, apparently. That could be true, it could also not be true, because there was a huge motivation from especially the church hierarchy at the time, the Roman Catholic Church. At the time, particularly, they were very hell-bent on demonizing serpents and wolves, because serpents and wolves were heavily associated with earthly chaotic energies, and of course to the church that was satanic. So of course they did their best to demonize wolf imagery and serpent imagery the best they could, because you can even look at archaeology and see plenty of like wolf and serpent designs on rune stones. The evidence is there, you just gotta look. It wasn't until the end of the Viking Age that you started to see images of Thor on rune stones fighting Jormungandr and so on. The wolf warriors were, a very common practice. The Ulfednar, they were essentially berserker type warriors that would take on their animal spirits, which were wolves, kind of like how the berserkers would take on bears when they go into their warrior rages. And such animistic concepts exist all over the world, like I've mentioned in previous videos. Hati chasing the moon could be very symbolic of some sort of emotional doubt and fear, and that's what the Jotuns often represent. They represent sort of the threshold of fear where you are in your comfort zone and you are ready to evolve. Essentially, the Jotuns, especially Odin, Odin often goes and ventures all over the 9 realms to seek knowledge. So when Odin ventures and seeks knowledge, essentially he challenges himself and he crosses many thresholds, in order to essentially achieve his higher goals and becoming a better version of himself, and essentially becoming a more effective ruler and a more effective ally to his friends. Though Odin, during his particular journey, he was quite malicious, and that's why there are quite many comparisons between him and Loki. But then again, of course, you'll think about that from a Christianized point of view and consider them demonic. But then again, I can get into the Bible, but then again, those who have read the Bible know what I'm talking about, what I'm referring to. But, at the same time, when it comes to Odin and Loki, they sort of have a bond, and that's a blood bond in a way, and their goal is to essentially achieve knowledge together and to essentially operate as sort of twin companions, even though especially the Prose Edda, they talk a lot about Loki being binded, and of course his intricate punishment for just being a bad person, just being a bad god. Well, if you were to read the Elder Edda, which is sometimes referred to as the Poetic Edda, it actually refers to, a lot of events that are very particular, very intricate, and reveal more of the heathen past than the Prose Edda does, because the Prose Edda was written later on and it has a lot more Christian influence. You of course gotta pick at the sources, if you want to read either one. Don't just rely on the Eddas. You'll have to look at archaeology and check out many of the sagas, and there's of course other books out there. So essentially go forward with what you are drawn to most when it comes to your path. Anyway, now we are moving on to Bill. And Bill, don't laugh, but that is his daughter. And it's interesting because in the Norse tradition, especially in the myths, they talk a lot about the gods changing genders or shifting masculinity or femininity depending on what magical role they're performing. So, sort of what would be considered a masculine name for a female would be something that would just be attributed to sort of the energy and overall presence of that entity. Just kind of like how in language there is masculine and feminine words, there could be a connection there. But when we were talking about Mani in particular, the moon is often referred to as a feminine entity in many cultures. The moon, Luna, it's often referred to as feminine, but Mani, in a Norse context, is could be referred to as sort of a feminine and masculine Jotun. Sort of like a balance, because he has two daughters, a son and a daughter, Huki, which would, by some people, would consider, a feminine sounding name, but that is just because Huki is a healing figure, and that is usually referred to as a feminine attribute, but that's not something that's just makes you a woman. It's just a detail, a description about yourself, and how you help society, because Seidr was known to be a very feminine art, but it was all about healing, and it was very focused about that. And, of course, there were inserted segments that were likely Christian influence, where Loki or other gods would tease certain male deities for practicing Seidr. For instance, Odin, even though Loki is a total hypocrite because he totally would practice Seidr, because he practices plenty of feminine arts, and he also shapeshifts into feminine entities and has children. So it's just kind of like, there's the kicker. But anyway, so besides the point, Huki means healing, and then the daughter Bill means moment, quite literally moment. And so it's interesting because when the full moon is out, it's sort of like a very important moment for the Norse. They gather, they have their festival. Excuse me. They gather, they have their festivals, they have their their holidays, and they honor their deities and many of their ancestors on full moons, kind of like Alphablot, which is coming up soon in October, or could be in November, but I'm not sure. I'll have to see soon. But that's just if I'm following the lunar calendar. Okay, and now moving on to Sunna. You have Sunna, who is said to have been born from the realm of fire, and that being Muspelheim. And of course the stars were said to have been pulled from Muspelheim, the realm of fire. So the sun being a star, it makes sense, because Sunna is a star. The sun is a star. And Sunna is of course also a Jotun, and she, often, it's often referred to the sun as a masculine entity, but you see it's flopped. So Sunna is sort of like a masculine woman, and this could be perceived differently depending on each individual and each practice, but this is sort of my own spiritual perception of it all. And certain people would feel the same, but besides the point. If we are talking about the actual translations, I am also adding that in when I'm talking about the mythological figures, because when you translate the names of mythological figures, it quite literally describes their function. And so if we are talking about the father of both Mani and Sunna, their father did not have a spouse, or they didn't mention a spouse. Mani was just birthed, he just came from Mundulferi, and same with Sunna. And Mundulferi is also a Jotun, and Mundulferi, if I'm correct, means the great mover. So essentially Mundulferi is kind of like this, Titan, Jotun, giant-like force that essentially helped shape the sun and the moon. And that could be perceived as sort of concept of change, how change essentially shaped the moon toward away from the earth, and of course how over time the sun formed, and etc. But when we are talking about the wolf that chases Sunna, just Skull, that is also sort of like a solar eclipse, and it's when the wolf chases Sunna and essentially covers her, so she is mostly invisible. And that could have been believed by the Norse as sort of a solar eclipse. And from a literal standpoint, it does make sense. And of course, when we are talking about Sol, there is mentioned her horse, which is Arvak, which is sort of her flaming horse that pulls her chariot. And Arvak was of course put in the game Skyrim, or his name was, but that is of course named after the horse that the goddess Sunna rides, or the goddess Sunna pulls. It's the horse that pulls Sunna's chariot. Now we are moving on to the translation of Skull and Hati. Skull meaning the one who mocks, and that is the wolf that chases the sun. And so when we are talking about Sun's name being Sol, or Sunna's name being Sol, that is the Latin pronunciation, and soul is literally the soul, the spirit. And so when we are talking about the one who mocks, Skull is essentially the one that is scolding. They are mocking the soul, they are mocking the spirit, and essentially the point of scold, in a sort of a spiritual concept, could be to not listen to those who mock you. It's sort of a test, an illusion. Skull is there to essentially throw obstacles in front of you, for people to walk up to you and just question your beliefs in yourself, or what path you're on. There are those who mock you, those who want to sway you from your path, and that's what Skull means. But then you have Hati, and then of course and that means the one who hates. And Skull, and Skull being the one who mocks, of course compliments the one who hates, because when we are talking about Mani is the mind, because in sort of a spiritual concept, you could say that the moon reflects the sun, meaning the mind reflects the soul. That is essentially sort of a spiritual draw there. And Hati, being the one who hates, is attributed to the moon, the mind, which is very emotional. And since the mind is very emotional, we can tend to hate things for no reason. And it's sort of about watching our doubts and our fears, so we don't end up hating things that we don't need to hate. And it's all about essentially sort of reflecting on all these mythological entities and applying it to our lives, and essentially for those who desire and those who feel connected to these entities in particular, sort of include them in their spiritual practice, because such things could be very beneficial, because of course the sun itself is very healing, and it helps grow the crops with photosynthesis. So it was always seen as a healing thing that sort of gave to the land. And of course the same could be said for water, which we will talk more about like I said, when we'll get into the rune lagus. But anyway, so I'm going to end my video here. Thank you so much for watching, everybody. Hail and stay safe. And please, please, please love yourself. Thank you. And if you can, please like and subscribe and hit the bell. Thank you.